Mm-hmm.
Alrighty, so welcome to the Jordan B Peterson community. This is our YouTube discussion page or our podcast for our recorded summary sessions. We do discussions every Saturday or Friday nights if you're from America. So we have two sessions, two time zones, and then we do these recorded summary sessions. Now, on the last week of every second month of this, the study group becomes a reading group instead, where we discuss one of Peterson's recommended texts. At the end of this month, so end of September, we will be discussing maps of meaning, and you can find all the details at jordanbpeterson.community. So instead of .com, that's .community. And this episode, we're going to be discussing the Jordan B Peterson versus Sam Harris debates that happened earlier this year, but the videos only went live on their accounts, I think, a few weeks ago. So we've done, it's going to be similar to, I guess, the last podcast we've done. We've been doing these discussions for the Sam Harris versus Peterson debates the last few weeks. But we had some really good discussions this week, and you find them on the topic in the link below, our complete discussion notes. But otherwise, here we are to discuss our biggest takeaways from it. And I'm joined here by John as well as Kurt.
What's up, everyone? Good evening.
You're too energetic, Kurt.
I do what I can.
All right. I want to start off with, I think, Sam Harris's finest point in the discussion, and one that I don't think Peterson properly addresses, but or at least not directly, but I think we can try and consider it a little bit better. So Harris brings up how when you have two different types of religions, say like the Hinduist religion and the Christian religion, and they have completely different, they both metaphorically work within like in attaining whatever goals are necessary for that is built into us. The Harris, his goal is to get to the underneath or the reality behind what these metaphor, like the literal truths that are nested underneath all of the superstition, and to use that in order to derive your moral ethic, let's say, as opposed to the superstitious overpinnings that is kind of tacked on. And I think like Peterson's only real objection to that is that the rational reasonings for why you should do good things isn't always effective at actually attaining those good things. And I think the classic example of this is in avoiding masturbating, where if you have the story in mind that God watches you masturbating and disapproves of it, then that may have a higher effectiveness at keeping you from masturbating and essentially wasting time and energy and resources that could be put towards better means, rather than, say, any rational arguments that could be put into place in order to keep yourself from doing such an act. So the point being that there's a higher effectiveness towards the story elements that have been tacked on than the rational arguments that are the truth behind it, even to the point where just knowing these truths aren't effective enough at causing you to care about the truths.
Well, I would say to that having a metaphorical gun to your head is an outstanding motivator for all kinds of things, regardless of whether those things are good or not. So you provided an example. I think we could provide many different kinds of examples, some of which wouldn't be good. But if you really believe that God is watching over you and will punish you if you don't do something and so forth and so on, then that belief would create a strong incentive for you to engage in behavior you might otherwise not. So it is a complete singular motivation to any end that you might want to posit. And so from that point of view, it's somewhat unhelpful because it doesn't have any limiting derived principle. You know, if I wanted to argue with you to motivate you to do something like, for example, have this discussion with me that we're having right now, I could appeal to your desire to learn something. I could appeal to your desire to refine your ideas, refine my ideas, engage in social behavior. So there's a lot of things I could appeal to do. But that line of argument that I just made would presumably apply to this stream. It might also apply to other things that I might want you to do, but it doesn't have infinite scope. Those lines of argument are narrower in terms of what they can justify. The problem with the God hypothesis is it has essentially infinite scope. It doesn't have any limiting principle. So I don't see it as a rationale. It's essentially an appeal to, you know, the monster on your bed is going to get you. I mean, that's not a good motivator.
Okay, so yeah, that's where I guess we need to clarify our definitions then. Well, a good motivator has to be one that is that aligns with reality. Whereas you could also consider the definition of a good motivator as that which is effective at motivating. So I suppose the ideal is something that entails both of those scenarios, which would be very nice, I guess. But I don't think those are always the same thing.
Well, I think the appeal to God has the same generalized problem that Peterson himself points out with ideology in general. The problem with ideology is that it reduces everything to a singular cause. So if you are a modern social justice warrior kind of person, the cause of every ill is the patriarchy. It is the singular explanation for everything because it is completely undifferentiated. And so everything can fit into the framework because the framework doesn't mean anything. It's a global label for just anything bad I disagree with. It has no substance behind it. You might as well just call it reason X for all the good it's doing you. So the problem is not even its truth or lack thereof. Well, that's a problem, but not the immediate problem. The immediate problem is that the appeal to God, the appeal to the patriarchy, the appeal to ideology, the appeal to the X is a singular, undifferentiated motivator without any limitation. You can't logic your way through any derived principle. And conversely, you can fit every principle into it because there's no ability to segregate. And so it's a pointless, useless framework because it doesn't tell you anything.
It doesn't tell you anything. Okay, so like you can't like classify it into any specific property.
If I say God wants you to do X, how would you argue for or against that proposition? And the answer is you can't. Because it doesn't give you anything to work from. If I tell you that God has given me a revealed truth and he wants you to do X, how do you argue against that proposition or for that proposition? You can't. Whereas if I say, okay, you should do these things because here are some reasons that support that rationale that are specific to that rationale, that doesn't justify everything. You should talk to me because it will help you get more well-educated. That argument does not say why you should go play soccer. It has nothing to do with it. So it's a differentiated rationale. It applies to some contexts and not others. It's a supporting argument for some things and not others. If you say the reason is God, it applies to everything and applies to nothing. It is just a label for anything you want to be true. I can't reason with it.
Mm-hmm. I see. Yeah, that makes sense. In working through Jonathan Haidt's, I guess, project, there's a realization that most of our morality is based off of our moral intuitions, which is essentially what Sam Harris is utilizing in order to make the case for the moral landscape, because it's essentially a universal moral intuition that this thing is bad and should be avoided. And that's effective for the most extreme cases. For a lot of the more regular uses of morality, there is a intuitive sense for what we should do and what we shouldn't do, which is adaptive to our environments for sure, and definitely not something that has been ever present and always the same throughout our time. And it seems like generally, in order to confirm or in order to develop some sort of ethic, a lot of it is based upon the moral, intuitive, like accuracy, I guess. Like, you give me a proposition for an ethic, and then I kind of judge it against my intuitive sense for like what is right, what is wrong, and there might be like simulations run, like how would this ethic work out across time, and then I either approve or I reject of the ethic before, not necessarily through reasoning, but if I was trying to make my case against it, I would have to utilize my reasoning for it. But generally, the reasoning is our post hoc rationalization for why or why not some sort of thing. So, like the case for the antinatalists, that they have a logically based argument for antinatalism, but through their conclusion that it would be better for the human race to voluntarily go extinct, that goes against our kind of intuitive sense for what should be done for humanity. And so there's rational arguments can be made against it.
Sorry. I'll say a couple things to what you're saying. First of all, I would define a moral proposition as any proposition that tells anyone how they should live or behavior they should engage in, which would include myself because I qualify as anybody. Mm-hmm. So let's say that that's what moral is. Now, moral reasoning can be used to justify, as you suggested, as Haidt also suggests, but it can also be used to communicate with other people and things that might not have occurred to them naturally. For example, if you're the kind of person that for some reason it would never occur to you to exercise, it's just not an idea that would ever cross your mind. If I say you should exercise and you say why, and I say because if you do, it will help improve your health and make you feel better, among other reasons, then I've made a moral proposition and I've defended it with a rationale that is in this particular context relevant and wouldn't be relevant in other contexts. So it's a reason that justifies it. Now, you can disagree with me about the exercise thing because you say, well, you know, what I really like most in life is sitting on my butt and watching television. So it's not necessarily not a sufficient argument. I might have to come up with other lines of argument, but my argument flows from my presupposition. It flows into this. And so, you know, we can reason with each other with moral reasoning. And I think you're right that in a lot of cases we backwards engineer the reasons after we've already decided to engage in behavior. So we justify things after the fact. But if we're communicating to each other, I can justify things to you before the fact. You should do X. Here's some reasons. And you say, oh, those are good reasons, or oh, those are bad reasons, and then we can have a discussion about
it. Mm-hmm. So I see what you're saying, and it's not like everyone who argues for theism is not using reasoning for their morality. A lot of their morality is built off of the presupposition that there is intention behind the things that we have been given and experienced within the universe. So if something bad happens to us, there's an assumption that this is some sort of punishment for a failure on our parts. And in order to...
But yeah, the pure, you see, the thing is with the problem with the pure belief in God is it doesn't tell you what you should do. It's actually completely insufficient from a position of moral reasoning. Because let's go to a deism position, which is just that there is a God of some kind. So I tell you there's a God, and you believe me. Okay, what should you do? It doesn't tell you anything. It doesn't say what you should do or what you shouldn't do. Because there's no way to derive from a belief in God that you should engage in a particular behavior or shouldn't believe in a particular behavior. If that's your premise, it doesn't suggest anything. Whereas a premise of you should improve your health because it would be good for you is a premise that does suggest some courses of action. It does suggest eating healthier. It does suggest exercising. So that premise, you should take care of yourself in terms of your health, suggests particular courses of action and suggests against other courses of action. So it is a proposition that suggests behavior. If the proposition is there's a God, it doesn't tell you anything about what you should do or shouldn't do at all. It's completely insufficient for moral reasoning.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's just having a fact about whether or not God exists. It's just like the fact about chimpanzees will kill their outgroup members. It's a fact about nature, but I agree, it doesn't tell you anything about like how to act.
Well, if the chimpanzee would consider me a part of his outgroup, it would suggest I should stay well clear.
Well, that's adding in values though amongst it.
Well, I'd like to not die. This is a proposition for myself. I'd like to not die. That'd be good.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But even if I want to serve God, if I believe in God and I want to serve God,
mm-hmm.
It still doesn't tell me how. I have no idea what to do. There's a God. I'd like to serve him. What should you do? I have no clue. It doesn't tell me anything.
There is the point here, like on itself, then it doesn't tell you because there can be contention about, anyone can say God wants this or whatever, and then they would all bring over contentions which then have to be argued rationally. Like God says you should bathe, kind of thing, and then you can argue, well, why would God believe that? But then the utility of it seems to be that it's easy to then plug on extra beliefs or extra traditions onto one's existing God that people have already built up consensus as well as trust in. So for instance, if there is a society which, through through the verbal lineage or the verbal history, I guess, says, okay, all these traditions, God says, and, they could have, or maybe originally they did have rationale or secular rationale for doing those things, then it becomes easier to then think, okay, well, this God then also wants me to do this extra thing. Okay, well, I already trust this God and all these other reasons. In the same way, like you establish trust with other people. And if, you consider one person smart and wise and they generally have good advice, and then they suggest something else, then there's trust in there that the new suggestion is going to be accurate. But it then leads into the same type of valid criticisms that, well, then you can add on some crazy things that haven't been justified or tested, and then deceive people with malintent.
But what you're saying, or at least what I'm hearing from you, and you'll have to correct me if I'm wrong, but what I'm hearing from you is like when you talk about justification or testing, we're the ones doing the testing. We're in this hypothetical. The rule for bathing, which was your example, we'll use that. So we discovered that bathing was a good idea. Why? Well, we didn't know exactly why it was a good idea, although we now could explain it with germ theory. But we discovered that it was a good idea. So this was something we discovered through trial, error, or otherwise. So you don't need to go to the next step of this is something God wants, because there's no reason to make that next step. You can just stop at this is a good idea and we should do it. You don't need God to provide a motivation. You're the ones who invented the motivation in the first place.
Yeah, certainly. But all of that is true. But I think there is utility in, for instance, if we then have to argue and reason over every single thing we should do, then that's a lot of reasoning that then each individual then has to take on board. They would then have to critique every commandment that they're given. And I mean commandment in the general loose term of just something that is beneficial for one to do. Because you have to, as an individual, establish the truth or the validity of every single thing you should do. Whereas if you just...
you can inherit the wisdom from our ancestors, because our ancestors discovered bathing, and so you've discovered this. And if you were to examine it, you would discover it to be a good reason. And I think to some degree, every ethic position is questioned by humanity in general. I don't know if there's any ethic proposition that is not questioned somewhere sometime. Now, you might not question bathing, but I bet you someone somewhere is. So these positions are being reevaluated continuously. But we don't have. I don't have to redo this work. That would be like me saying I have to, I don't know, rediscover how an engine in a car is made. No, I don't. I have, a bajillion people who came before me that tells me how to build an engine in a car. They discovered how to build an engine in a car, and it's gotten better over time. So in the same way we learned how to build an engine in a car, we also learned how to build a set of ethics. It's gotten better. I don't have to reinvent it. They did the work for me.
Yeah. So then for the engine example, you're then saying, well, I don't need to be a mechanic because then I can hire a mechanic to, run my car or fix it when it breaks down. In which case, and you then say, I trust the mechanic because there's a history of mechanics, building up an industry where they take care of cars. So I don't need to question the mechanic or reevaluate, study it myself because, they've already, through word of mouth or trust and consensus, they've already demonstrated the value.
Yeah, I would say that's true.
Yeah. So then I think the thing here is that I'm just using God here as like an abstraction of then, the rules that we should live by, or, the ultimate ideals or whatever you want to put it as. So then in the same way that, so for instance, in that essence, then we're trusting the mechanics to act.
If you want to define God that way, then I'll immediately concede your point. I'll concede to God in that framework, because if God is merely the distilled zeitgeist of our human learned experience in the various domains, then okay, great. But the term God suggests a supernatural entity with particularized power. So if you want to say God is our distilled wisdom that we have invented, then great. We can concede the point, but I'm interested if whether or not the God of the supernatural variety exists.
Yeah. I don't think it seems for that argument, to me the argument between Harris and Sam is Harris is arguing about the deity and then Peterson's arguing about the abstraction. Because I don't think there is anyone who can hold the weight in an argument arguing that the deity exists, because they're just going to have all the arguments that, Hitchens, Dawkins, and all the other new atheists, like the Four Horsemen, have put forward. And they're just going to fall on their face. And I think that's why Peterson avoids entering into that realm altogether, because he doesn't want to be associated with defending something that has already been destroyed.
Maybe that's his motivation. But it seems to me like if we're talking about story, philosophy, wisdom, or whatever other label we want to put on this thing, then it seems to me there's three propositions we might put forward. the proposition that all those came from God, the propositions that at least some of them came from man, and the proposition that all of them came from man. And
Right.
so proposition one doesn't make any sense, because something like postmodernism, I don't think anyone would argue is something that God came up with, because it's totally bankrupt. At least in this audience, we wouldn't agree with. We wouldn't say that. So
I haven't read enough postmodernism to really make a judgment on that.
Well, Marxism. Pick something else of equally horrible repute. It doesn't matter. Any story, any philosophy will work for this example.
Mm-hmm.
So pick your favorite. So it can't be that all stories, philosophies came from God. So it seems that therefore we're at least in proposition number two. Some of them came from man. Marxism, postmodernism, X came from man. So then we can go to the question of proposition number three. Did all of them come from man? And that's where Peterson refuses to clarify the question.
Okay, so this is this can actually mean different things, right? Because is it that, you know, man operated and then what, you know, failed terribly, and then what, you know, passed the test of survival? Then we, like, is that really man then projecting a morality, or is that the universe projecting its morality onto us and then we're just noticing? Because if it's the latter, then that pays way to this abstracted God, or even it doesn't need to be abstracted God, as if morality is then external to us and we just have to abide. Like we discover morality in the same way we discover physics or biology, where we're just observing what works and what doesn't work. Whereas if we're the ones who can actually...
What doesn't work, that's exactly what I think.
Sorry, pardon?
No, that's exactly what I think. I think we're observing what works and what doesn't work. And the same thing, morality. We've posited many different moralities over the course of human history, and many of them didn't work. And so those were bad moralities.
So then the question there is, well, is the origin of what works and what doesn't work, is that of human origin or is that of natural origin? Because if it's of natural origin, then it's outside of the human.
Well, I think it's largely natural. I mean, if I posited, you know, fire would help keep you warm, and so you should be around fire. If you get too close and so it burns you to death, this is, let's concede, not a desirable outcome. So that is something that nature has revealed to you. So I don't necessarily object to the idea of some of these truths being taught by natural forces. Don't go approach the grizzly bear, it won't end well. That's fine.
I think one thing I'm interested in is like the question, like, do you have control over that which you find admirable, or even that which you find valuable?
Probably not completely. I think that would be a difficult proposition.
Because
I would say at least in part we don't.
Yeah, it seems to be a product of, let's say, your unconscious that you utilize in order to build up your morality, and then you test these out, and then over time you kind of get a closer idea of like what works and what doesn't work, and what should be valued and what shouldn't be valued, or like who should be valued and who shouldn't be valued.
Pretty trivial example of this. I mean, if I'm the kind of person that has a mind or personality such that I find gambling unbelievably pleasurable, you know, that isn't strictly speaking a decision I'm making, and it's destructive. So,
gotcha.
You know, I think that's fair.
Yeah. So it's not based off of any singular person, because a singular person can very easily wind up in some sort of position of being mistaken about what is best for them. Like they could become addicted to some sort of narcotic and think that is the best thing that should happen to them because it fulfills them and brings them well-being, and it is killing them, but it's a worthwhile suicide, let's say, on their part, that they see it as.
I think it's actually even slightly worse than that. People have an unbelievable ability to justify things to themselves they wouldn't tolerate in others. It's the fundamental attribution error. When I look at you and your behavior, I see character. When I look at myself and see my own behavior, I see circumstance. So it's like, well, I'm able to engage in this shady thing because I have really good reasons. But when you engage in this shady thing, it's because you're a bad person. So yeah, people have very high capacity to deceive, mislead themselves. So yeah, when we're trying to figure this out, we're talking on sort of a shared, collective, learned level over time of what is good and bad.
Yeah, which it's different from the kind of top-down approach that is kind of put forward by Harris, or even earlier before that with kind of like Plato.
We crowdsourced it.
Yeah, exactly. It's decentralized kind of development of morality.
Yeah, that's basically exactly what I'm positing. I think exactly that. We decentralized it over the period of, at least since writing was invented, when we had the ability to literally compare notes, and we have engaged in this decentralized learning process of what is moral and immoral, and we've gotten better, and I don't think we've reached the limit yet, and by any stretch. So
okay, well,
I just assume give us as humanity credit for that, for our great work.
I mean, it's just adapting to the environment. I guess, sure. Yeah, good for them, or good for us. I tend to think it's arisen quite before that, or at least in its verbalized form. Kind of, okay, so let's see. Peterson always brings up how there's a ethic within the wolf community, let's say, where
I like that.
The wolves are acting out this behavior without having some sort of like formalized rule set system. And there is a system of oughts, basically, for how to act. Like if you're the leader of the chimp tribe, you're going to be kissing the babies of the female chimps, and you're going to be looking after the well-being of the weaker chimps within your tribe. Because if you don't do that, 2 or maybe 3 of the beta chimps, they're going to kill you for that. And then you can just kind of escalate out from there the observed ethic through okay, so it's like we observe each other, how we act, and then the consequences of those actions, and then we post hoc rationalize some sort of reasoning for why the things that happened, and like what is the cause. Like, is there some sort of like and it's very easy to do this with some sort of personification of the environment, if you consider living out your life in a way that is pleasing to God, you're going to be living out your life in a way that is in tune with the social community that you act within. And then that social community, because of how you have been able to tame the environment in a godlike form, you are heralded as king. And then people observe that, and they tell stories about that king-like god of Gilgamesh, or any like ruler of the tribe, like Alexander the Great has this son of God quality to him. And then, so that does happen also with writing, where like these gods of men become kind of connected together, so that all of the admirable traits that we recognize as admirable, the most godlike men, are held up as the pinnacles of moral behavior.
Yeah, if we're trying to come up with a prototypal man or archetypal man, and so we're trying to look at the collective wisdom of the human experience to determine what are the best qualities of the archetypal man, then That's fine.
Excuse me. It isn't a ethic, though, based off of our rationality, or at least not how I understand rationality. Rationality for me just means like from a set of propositions you can reach conclusions, and
Well, I don't know. I don't know that I don't know that I necessarily agree with that, because if we think about discovery of ethics versus, say, discovery of like a scientific principle, once in a long, long ago, the sun would disappear sometimes in the middle of the day, and we collectively said, "What is up with this stuff when the sun is disappearing in the middle of the day? Why is this occurring?" And after a long time of trying to figure it out, we came up with a reason. So we made the observation that there was a mystery, and then I suppose in some sense post hoc the explanation. But we, in the same way, if you're thinking about behavior, whether you're a wolf or a human being, it's like, okay, this is a reality. Why is this a reality? And then we come up with an explanation for it. It doesn't seem that different to me.
well, in order to even have that mystery arise, there has to be some sort of value placed upon that object in the first place. So it's like if you're watching the ground and then you're watching an ant and then it disappears, it doesn't have the same mystery behind it of the sun itself disappearing, because
yeah, the sun's pretty important, I concede, and knowing why it disappears would be nice.
Uh-huh.
So I'm with you.
Yeah, our scientific endeavor itself is not predetermined, but it presupposes we have things worth valuing, and then to be a good scientist, you're discovering more about the things that we find valuable.
Right. And
I mean, it's where am I going?
if you're of a scientific disposition and you want to solve mysteries, you're probably going to solve the mysteries that seem like, if they were resolved, would be the most beneficial.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, great. Yeah. And therefore, what?
No, therefore, it's just a. I guess, yeah. Okay, so I guess, yeah, that's where Sam and Peterson kind of agree. In order to lay claims about how to act, you have to first ground it in what it is that we find valuable. So for Harris, that's we obviously find that of what isn't valuable, or that which would not be preferable, let's say, in everyone suffering as much as possible for all of eternity.
Yeah. But I agree with Peterson's criticism of Harris that it's a little difficult to say that is itself a fact. That is I agree with Peterson that that's a questionable proposition to say it's a fact. I would just say it's an observed reality, rather than saying, well, suffering being bad is factual. But it's, yeah, okay.
Okay, well, okay, what is your definition of fact then? Because it almost seems like, okay, so there's these certain axioms that we kind of start off with that we kind of observe, like the axiom of causality, or some sort of semblance of events have an effect upon events that occur after them. Anyway, sorry.
Yeah, well, to jump into that, I think fact is something we consider universally true. It's objective and it's universal. It's not something that is subjective or relative, because if it's subjective, then it's going to fall into the domain of opinion. So, for instance, if we talk about the suffering example, it's to qualify that as universally objectively true, then that is a leap that is going to be hard to apply, because there's definitely times when we do actually want enemies to suffer or even perish or die. For instance, we do not want jihadists to maximize their well-being by blowing people up. And so we do actually wish for those who are against our values to actually suffer.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And even if you could go to the next step of somehow every human being on Earth would agree something is bad, you still have to go to the next level up of saying, well, presupposing there's aliens, they may not agree it's bad from their point of view. So something like a fact would be, water is wet. You know, that's factual. It doesn't depend on anyone's subjective impression.
Okay.
Versus these horrors, which we would all agree as horrors, to say that that's factually, it's I agree with Peterson. That's a bit of a leap.
Mm-hmm. So can you derive these values from the scientific process? No, I guess not. But it's like, even if you can't, you can still, just like in the same way that we value what the sun's doing right now, and then we can use the scientific process to kind of give us a better understanding of that. And so we value, let's say, not having our citizens of a country committing suicide, and then we can analyze, okay, which countries aren't having the most suicides, or things like that, because that would be some sort of instance of assumed people not living up to their well-being standards.
Yeah, I mean, once we agree that something is valuable, then we would figure out how to address that issue, which is kind of like what governments do, at least in principle.
Yeah. So I guess my main criticism of Sam Harris, it was from his TED Talk, where he said that science can tell us what we ought not to value.
Yeah, I'm not sure you can do that.
I think I can understand like how he's making that claim. So it's like, let's see, if I believe that every time I walk into another room, I get $50 more put into my bank account. And that's like something I value to a great amount. And then science can disprove that to me by like showing me my bank account when I'm walking through my door. That would be a disagreement from.
Well, you don't need to go that complex with the rationale. For instance, for what science can tell us what we ought not to do, then we can use the example of bathing again. For instance, like once we establish a value and have that consensus, like we still need something subjective that we value, because we are still the observer of our reality. So we say we come to a consensus of what we value, and then we can use science to qualify and quantify that, like, you know, use the qualia to then say, okay, well, if we don't bathe, that will hurt what we value, so therefore we won't do it. And then say with the moral landscape, then that's the part of that, which is then to say, based on our consensus of our values, what can we measure to then objectively say that that is bad for the outcome of what we value. So for instance, I
was just thinking, this also kind of presupposes that subjective values are in some sense bad or incomplete, which we haven't really established either, because we've been trying to fight against the idea that there are objective values. It's like, well, if there are subjective values, why they're less complete, particularly when they've existed for long periods of times off many cultures. It's like, okay, not only do we value this, but human beings for a long time have valued this, so that's good. Let's do that.
Well, I think objective is harder to say for value, because value necessarily requires a observer. It requires someone who values. So you can say that something is certainly universal. Like you can say something is universally true for all humans. But to say it's subjective, then it's a failure of the logic of those words.
I kind of agree with you completely.
You need an observer.
Maybe all values are subjective. I'm not sure that's necessarily a problem.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. It doesn't seem to be a problem. The question is then to say, well, which ones are universal and which ones are relative? And for the ones which we have demonstrated to be universal, be it philosophically or scientifically, then we should probably see if we can maximize them, if that is an accomplishable goal and if that proves to be something we can do.
Yeah, I would suggest volatility is a good measure here. To the degree that the subjective value is less volatile by looking across cultures, across time, then those are better values because they're less volatile. Okay.
So would say like Buddhism and what Jainism, they have the highest values, or even like Amish communities, they're quite low in their volatility.
I don't know anything about Jainism at all. And
so Jainism, well, just for the sake of elaborating on it, so Jainism is pretty much veganism to a T. They believe everything that is living values life, and therefore you should not violate any of that will. So it takes ahimsa, which is the no harm principle, as the highest value. So the Jain priests, or you would call them, the more devoted ones, would then also wear face masks because they don't wish to kill bacteria. They would be naked. They only, for the diet of a Jain is to not eat anything where you had to kill. That includes, like, say, root vegetables like potatoes. So they only eat what has fallen from a tree or what doesn't kill the entire plant. And fundamentally, they don't eat meat. So if you want to, like, for the veganism, if you wish to take it to the extreme, then they would be Jains. But then Jains, they value no harm over other measures, like, say, success and propagation and things like that. So the average vegan, I think, puts, their well-being, their own subjective well-being, further or higher than the ability to not harm others. Where if you put not harming others above your own well-being, then that could arguably be what Jains prioritize.
Yeah,
I'm not particularly sure on that particular
I think this is where the biggest moral disagreements are, in some sense, is when you have multiple values that are all good, how you weight them is a real problem. This is essentially, as far as I can tell, why political parties disagree. It seems to be, as far as I can tell, how we weight various things. Not even that we disagree that they're important. It's just like how important when they're competing with each other. So, yeah, when you're dealing with multiple propositions that all seem true, how do you decide which is true and which is not true is a continuing struggle. The Jainisms and the Buddhism and the Amish have an answer that works for them. They don't seem to really be causing any harm to anyone else. So go forth, I suppose, and live your happiness.
Yeah. Yeah. John, do you have, were you going to say something?
No, you go ahead. Sorry.
All right. Yeah. So for that, I think me and John would probably agree. Peterson goes a lot into that about how to value things, or like that. That is one of the main issues, I think, during his lecture series. But to run with that a bit further, which is, I think this is one of the things which the failure of people to be able to believe in God scientifically has brought about a situation where before they had a narrative that ordered their values. And when that narrative became questionable, then people now had to take upon themselves on how to order values. Then there's been huge developments in the West in the last 100 years, notably women being able to work through the use of the pill, then gaining the rights to vote, and then also being able to enter into political work, or just even in all the aspects of work. So you've had this huge injection of agreeableness and eroticism into the social and political environment and the work environment as well. And personality, which is one of the things Peterson discovered, influences what we value, our big five personality traits. So that then plays its role with this injection into what society values. So women vote more socialist, and men generally vote more conservative when you take into account, you know, the big five personality traits of those of that generalization. So then it's interesting because now we have the opportunity, and the internet has also birthed this, where we can polarize or what is it called? Fractionate.
Siloing is what I usually say when we silo each other.
Siloing. Yeah, so we can, you know, just believe what we want to believe, and there's no necessity anymore to actually get along, or, you know, like we can just, fraction off instead of saying like, okay, I need to put up with you because you're my neighbor and we have to live together, or eat, you know, maybe eat at the same table with our family. Instead, we can just be like, no, your values are so different than mine. You're evil and I'm right, and I'm going to surround myself with other people who I think is right.
Yeah, it's unclear to me the degree to which that's a short-term problem because the technology is relatively new versus something that's more long-term, and I don't think anyone knows the answer to that question yet. But we're in this. I think to some degree this has occurred with the advent of most new technologies. You know, I would imagine that when printing first came to existence, I mean, that allowed people to silo themselves more than before, right? So I think to some extent we've been through this before. So maybe this is going to be something that we'll mature out of. We'll see, I suppose.
Yeah. Yeah, it's certainly, it's interesting, right? Because then like the Amish, and my mum's kind of nearing this idea where she's like, the world's too chaotic now. I don't particularly want to live in it. And,
but like it's actually an interesting idea when you were talking about the internet, because it reminded me of what you were saying earlier about how we can't really like recreate all these values or question all these values that have been established from our ancestors, with the bathing as the example being. So one thing the internet gives us the capacity to do is question all values. We can do all this. It's contemporaneously right now, and we are. So we'll see how that's going, I suppose.
Yeah, I wanted to bring that up because I think that's an interesting point by Sam Harris that needs to be considered. That if science were to prove what we value to be an inaccurate assumption about what is, would and should we dissolve that value within our own mindset? So
if we're all trapped in Plato's cave, then I would like to know that so we can leave.
What if you can't leave? That would be, is that something like if you realize you're in the Matrix but you can't leave the Matrix, would that change how you live?
I don't know. I'm probably in the Matrix, and you know, it's fine. So it's all good. I don't know if it would or not, to be honest.
So you're a Cypher character, I see.
I don't know. It's like arguing against free will. From my point of view, it's a pointless argument.
Yeah, that's what I wanted to
prove. I don't have free will. I can't do anything about it.
Yeah, so that's what I wanted to bring up. So the reason that the leftists are mad at Sam Harris is because he's been too cavalier with his approach to racial IQ differences. So there is this fundamental value within the more open-minded types that we should have equality and treat each other as if we're all the same people. And so through science or through cataloging of IQs and races, that belief that we're all the same is kind of faltering. And there is an obvious pushback from that from the people that hold equality as their highest value. In the same way, for people that have freedom as their highest value, for science to determine that you have no causal relationship to how you act, and you're basically just running off of background processing, that is a uninspiring.
That's doing nothing for me. It's like it's all the same to me. If I'm deterministic, it's all the same to me. So what's your point? It's like, okay, you know. But I think you make a fair point. But I think You know, when you think about equality as an idea, it's like if we're not actually all equal, then it would perhaps be nice to know that so that we might be able to take steps based on that.
Mhm.
Maybe there's things we could do to help correct for that. So
Yeah,
us
well, this is
put us in a position to be able to try to address it in some way.
yeah, well, that's the exact argumentation that got James Damore fired from Google, which is the idea that okay, maybe
Right.
yeah, that the sexes are different, and the scientific literature seems to say, and if we wish to meet the diversity quotas or improve diversity in our company, then we should take into account those differences and move towards them. But if so, this is where postmodernism had a good idea and a bad idea. And the good idea is we should question everything to find out what's actually true. But the bad idea is that we can actually assert what we believe is true onto nature, and that everything is a social construct. And so, like, say for the
But you can put the slightly more hopeful vision of that exact idea is that we should be working to impose our vision on nature, because to some degree we can, and some degree we do. I mean, what is building a house but putting our vision onto nature? And so we can do the same thing socially in a whole bunch of other ways. It'd be nice to know what the reality is.
Yeah, it's interesting, right? Because so that will open up a new discussion point that we should do just to finish this point. I guess for the value of the listeners, which is so for Google, for instance, then they're operating on the belief that that things are a social construct, and therefore, and I think the reasoning here is that if you have run out of people to hire qualified engineers, then you look into the workforce and you find, okay, well, what's the underrepresented groups that we can now tap into? So then you devote all your marketing and training resources towards getting that underrepresented group.
Right, exactly.
Now, if it is fundamentally true that the sexes are different, then it means you've already maxed out to more of an extent your hiring potential and your ability to scale. But when you have unlimited demand for your product, you still need to scale exponentially. Therefore, it is more convenient for you to believe that gender is a social construct. Therefore, you can get women to operate as men and therefore still scale your workforce in an unlimited fashion. But as James
Damore pointed out, there's ways to deal with that problem. It's like we can change the way we do business to more readily acquire the kind of talent we're looking to acquire. So he proposed a very pragmatic solution, because one possibility is we'll social engineer the thing, which seems hard if possible at all. It's like, well, we can change the way we do business. If we change the way we do business, women might be more attracted to it. And then we've solved the problem.
Yeah, and that's like the same reason why digital nomading or remote work has gone up, because it is more applicable to women's tastes. And to some extent, like it's quite it's just worth stating that explicitly, because a lot of people don't understand that issue that well. And not to say their understanding is wrong, it's just another interpretation of it. But for this idea then about we should impose our will onto the world, I think that's certainly true. We should, and I did a series of tweets recently talking about how in any relationship or role or hierarchy, then one person is imploring their will on another. So this is the master subordinate morality that Nietzsche talks about. But you think of this in terms of your boss and the employee, or you think of this as the wife and the husband. Now, in a relationship, if the relationship is functionally well, then both in different areas are masters and subordinates. And whenever you admire your master, then you actually wish to be subordinate to them, to learn and to assist. So, for instance, if you're working at Tesla, then you wish to assist Elon Musk, accomplishing his visions because you admire him.
Show me a man of vision, and I'll follow him all day long.
Yeah. So this is this idea of, and so you think of this in the initial courting phase, which is anytime someone courts or develops a relationship, it's essentially to say, I am now imploring my will that you will be my girlfriend or my boyfriend, and you can accept that if you wish. but you know, that's the reality that I'm now portraying to you, and you know, you can take it or leave it. Whereas the ones who, you know, like would you like to be my girlfriend kind of thing, then they're going to get kicked out because they're not promising or imposing a reality onto the other person that is appetizing. Because, and I think the thing that was so nifty about Nietzsche and Beyond Good and Evil was he actually talked about how fundamentally humans do have this subordinate capacity. We do have this desire to be dominated in an extent, and it differs from person to person and from context to context. And that's one of the reasons he argues why slavery has been such a major component to humans' history.
But it doesn't always have to be out of animus, and it can be very voluntary, as you just pointed out. It's like, you know, if you find someone that's truly a vision, it's like you want to follow them because it's like, it's just so wonderful. So, yeah.
Yeah. Now, if anyone's listening and then they think I just made an argument for slavery and I just justified all instances of it, then that is not the case. but my views on slavery,
that's the thing that people pick up on without you having to say it. But yeah.
So, but yeah, that's another debate. But that particular way is not good. But okay, to go back to your point, Kurt, about okay, well, let's implore our will onto nature. Like the example of building a house. I think this is a fundamental aspect. Like this is Howard Rourke from The Fountainhead. Like this is, there's actually a soap that my wife has called, it's just like a Christian soap, and it's got all these quotes on it. And one of it is, it is an absolute fact that all great things were created by great industrious men. And it's like exceptions, absolute none. And but it's a really interesting soap. I should take a picture of it. But I think there's a difference between like imploring our will to mold reality versus imploring our morality onto reality or onto nature. Because it seems to some extent nature only accepts our will if it already aligns with what is compatible with nature. If we try and implore our will onto nature or and it is against nature's morality, then it hurts us severely.
No, I totally agree with that. I mean, if you want to build a boat, it's like water has a particular density. There's a reality to it. You've got to make it buoyant. So, you know, you should probably do that or you're going to sink. So, yeah. I think there are reality. You can't impose, you know, maybe you wish water had a different density than it does. Well, I don't know what to tell you. It's just, that's the reality.
Yeah.
I like that analogy you made earlier, Ben, about how morality is almost kind of like gravity, where it has an effect, but it's like we're trying to work in accordance with whatever that effect is. And I definitely kind of see that, especially from a like behavioral training point of view, how you can see it where every instance of a negatively reinforcing event will be caused in the mind of the subject as a bad action or a bad event that should be attempted to be avoided. And so and then there's also the positively reinforcing events that can occur to whatever the subject is or the group of subjects that then can be associated with into some sort of positive event or good event.
Yeah. I think if we're just for the slavery point, this is something we raised in the discussion. I don't think we've talked about it in the podcast, but I think it's a useful argument. So when I got through around 40 minutes through the Sam Harrison Peterson debate, the first one, they keep talking, at least Sam talks about slavery as if it's something that is obviously bad. It's obviously evil. It's obviously wrong. And it should have been obvious throughout all of history that it was wrong. And it's strange because, well, it wasn't obvious through all of history that it was wrong. In fact, it was not that case at all. It was the complete opposite. It was something that was also viewed a lot as something justifiable. And there's this and I think this is where Harris seemed a bit like a clear thinking simpleton, is the phrase I used, which is probably a bit insolent. And I certainly would not want to say that to Harris's face.
It's a little bit yeah, it's a little bit insulting, man. But carry on.
Yeah. But it's I just mean it as just an argumentation for the following bit, because he's still brilliant. Like, that's the clear thinking thing. Like, he's probably the most clearest thinker in the world. But for the simpleton, I mean that purely from the moral side, which is, it just seems some things are obviously bad, and as if we don't need to question why. And certainly, like, it was until I did read Beyond Good and Evil that I actually thought, okay, well, Nietzsche actually makes some really good arguments that even slavery isn't necessarily good or evil. And that's part of Nietzsche's Beyond Good and Evil book. And in terms of like slavery, even economically, I can think of an example. And the example I've discussed previously is that when the Philippines says sex slaves, or as well in India, like in the places where it is of extreme poverty, parents may elect to sell one of their children or multiple children to protect another one. And to an extent, then, if we want to consider this from a well-being side, then you induce tremendous hardship on the lives that are going to slavery. But at the same time, you then reduce the hardships of those who weren't sold. And economically, then that can raise the boats, because if you have the option of letting everyone starve to death versus then selling one into prostitution, or even the child willingly choosing to enter into prostitution, such as Donya from Crime and Punishment, to protect the family, then these are instances where one incurs hardship to prevent hardship for future lineage. And it does seem to
hard.
raise
You have to make increasingly more compromised choices. This is one part of the Batman movies, Dark Knight, that I just did not understand. It was like Joker is on this whole quest. Is like, if you take away their comfort, all their rules about what's good and bad will disappear. And I'm sitting over here like, yeah. what's your point? It's like, yeah, these are things that we had to build up, like society at large. So yes, if you take away all that, we'll descend back into the state of nature, and therefore, what? You've proved nothing, as far as I'm concerned.
Are you referring to the Joker or my arguments right there?
I was referring to Joker, because it's like,
right.
Like, oh, I'm going to make it so that their false pretenses about what's moral disappears. I'm like,
right.
You're not doing anything of the kind. I don't get it.
Yeah, I did like the Batman movies.
They were great.
Yeah, I think the Joker was just so good. Like, but I think it's also like, they have to compress movies down into like often the lowest common denominator, depending on like, well, the lowest common denominator of the market they're wishing to hit, I guess. So not really probably the lowest. So that's the average denominator in the market that they're trying to hit. So
yeah, but it's like it seems like a stupid thing. Joker's trying to prove that if you make things suck would send into animalism. I'm like, yes, you're correct. I concede your point, and I don't get it. It's like is there anyone out there who's really putting forward the proposition that no, we're not really like that. We're really like the way we are now, and that's our true nature. I mean, no one's making this argument.
Right.
Something no one's
actually, people do make that. Like communists, like the left leaning, are making, where they think if they did communism, then it wouldn't turn out to be an atrocity.
Peterson says that's like a argument that I would do it right. I don't know if that's completely correct. I think it's more about a wish that something would be true. And when you say that communism hasn't really been tried, it's a statement, in my view, of I really wish this would work. it's this like hope. It's this hope statement of hope, I suppose. And the nice thing, or the nice or bad thing about hope is like you can have hope in the face of overwhelming evidence to the contrary. The hope beyond hope. So it's like, yeah, it hasn't ever worked out, but next time, okay.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I wanted to bring up that one of the quotes from Nietzsche that I think fits well with this when in Beyond Good and Evil. Well-being, the way you understand it, that is no goal. To us, that looks like an end, a condition which immediately makes human beings laughable and contemptible, something which makes their destruction desirable. The discipline of suffering, of great suffering. Don't you realize that up to this point, it is only this suffering which has created every enhancement in man up to now? The tension of a soul in misery which develops its strength, its trembling when confronted with great destruction, its inventiveness and courage in bearing, holding out against, interpreting, and using unhappiness, and whatever has been conferred upon it by way of profundity, secrecy, masks, spirit, cunning, and greatness, has not been given to it through suffering. Oh, has that not been given to it through suffering, through the discipline of great suffering? This is, I think, the core divergence between Peterson and Sam Harris. There's a point where Peterson points out he's kind of interpreting the moral landscape as this story between moving from the bad life towards the good life, whereas Sam Harris points out that it would be better to be born into the good life, and that it has like reached a peak of human well-being. To consider morality as entirely subjective upon the experiences had by the individuals, instead of, like, similar to Peterson, as some sort of actionable continuing process, like kind of like evolution, where you never stop, you never escape evolution, you're always evolving, just in different ways. It's not like evolution has gotten us to this point and now we're at the peak of the evolutionary process. We've hit it, and now this is the best thing evolution can make. Within the antinatalist position, it's very much using Sam Harris's same argumentation, where because the world is primarily composed up of suffering, and all of our history is made up of suffering, in order to justify creating a new life, you would have to give some sort of reasoning for why the inevitable suffering that will occur to future generations will be worth it, or because there's nothing to be lost by not having future generations, and there is a lot to lose, or essentially a I guess faltering. It's a cost of human well-being to make more people that are only going to experience suffering. And I know there's a lot of like psychology behind the people that hold the position of antinatalism. My frustration with Sam Harris is how both him and the antinatalists are utilizing the same framework for their justification. Like Sam Harris's moral landscape is built up off of the same intuitive process that the antinatalists are utilizing.
Yeah, well, I think in some sense, then I would just compare it to a scientific hypothesis. So the antinatalists and Sam Harris or anyone else is putting forward a hypothesis of, based on the evidence so far to date, they think that this is the correct moral posture, and these hypotheses are tested, and some of them are shown to be more robust and less volatile than others. So, this is fine.
Yeah, but it's still built up off of an intuition for like desiring the human race to continue. That intuition, granted, is a subjective experience, but it's not. You're essentially making an argument of morality based off of people that do not currently have any subjective experience, and based upon your actions will or will not have such a subjective experience. So it's like the creation of more people to have subjective experiences. I'm still in the process of like figuring this all out, because it's a complicated issue that I've been trying to tackle, and trying to tackle it from many different kind of angles, I guess.
Yeah.
But
I mean, for me, I think it's probably true that they're all subjective, but these are not necessarily. I think Peterson's frame of how to view the subjective is essentially correct. It's like, it's not only true for what's me now, but me in the future, and not only true for me, but true for my family and now and in the future. Not only true for my family, but true for society now and in the future. So once you throw in these additional constraints, then it dramatically narrows the pool. This is what he says, right? Is like the first half of postmodernism is true. Postmodernism is true. It's like there's an infinite number of ways to distill the world, but not all of them are valid, or not all of them are equally valid. It's like, well, how do you know? Well, the way you know is because we've tested them, and so we've determined this.
Yeah, Sam Harris's conception of the good life is a state, or a experience of being that is like, I guess, like quantifiable into a fact, let's say. Whereas Peterson is essentially crafting a story about what is desirable, like for you and into the future. It's a mode of conceptualizing something, but not in regards to the factual basis, but based upon some sort of ideal that you hold in mind.
Yeah, I think that's basically correct. Yeah.
I'm still interested in Sam Harris's point, though, about how our values that are based upon invalid assumptions, whether
you can come to the right conclusion for the wrong reasons, so that's clearly true. You can have bad evidence and still come to the correct conclusion. So just because you arrived at the correct conclusion doesn't mean you had the right evidence. So that's Sam Harris's point. It's like, yeah, some of these conclusions are correct, but the premise God exists is not correct. So that's fine for me.
I don't know if it's for everyone. Well, this is, I guess, a side experiment I had today, where I went to the Sam Harris subreddit and asked them the question, what to do when factual understanding of reality actually comes at the cost of experienced well-being? I didn't give any examples, just kind of leaving it up there. And a lot of the responses were definitely having the desire for truth as being more important, with the reasoning behind it that truth claims about reality will, in the long run, have a better well-being for you and, let's say, your generations after you as well.
Yeah, if you're living in a lie that you don't even know is a lie, then that's arguably worse. I mean, the easiest hypothetical is you're married, your wife is cheating on you, you have no idea. It's like, should you know? It's like you're happy as far as you're concerned. It's
Hmm.
like, should you be made aware of that information? Tough position. I mean, it's going to make things really difficult for a lot of people for a while, but I think the answer is probably yes, because it's like, even though it's going to be really difficult and lead to all this problem, it's like, do you really want to live in this world of deception? That's a tough proposition to argue for.
Well, it's also one of these points, which is, well, what causes more, like, because in the moral landscape, Sam argues, well, it's okay to hurt people if it's done to reduce harm. And I think that in the instance there, which is that the potential for harm increases the more that deception propagates. So, sure, saying what is true up front is going to hurt someone tremendously, then the potential of reducing further harm is going to be better. Potentially.
Hmm.
Yeah. So the quote unquote atheist point of view, and I say that because apparently Peterson says they don't exist, but moving past that, it's like the atheist point of view is, let's say that it would be chaotic and disruptive, but in the end, it's worth it. I mean, in some sense, that's a statement of hope, but
Hmm.
yeah, I think the truth. Even the Bible says the truth shall set you free. So let's put it to its limits, I suppose.
Well, I think this is when Peterson says there isn't any atheist, which is that there's so much of Sam Harris's beliefs that seem so strongly correlated with Christian ethics. Like his idea of well-being versus suffering is pretty much the same as heaven versus hell. And especially his steadfastness on them as if they should be these obvious things.
Even just like
Yeah.
responsibility for your own being as opposed to responsibility for your family environment or even the social environment around you. That's still a conception of morality that is prevalent within like most non-Western cultures. Okay, maybe not most, but many.
Yeah, but that said, the statement is more wrong than it is true from Peter. Like that Peterson statement, there is no atheist. I think it is far more wrong than it is true.
Very true.
Yeah.
Mhm.
So.
Well, it's interesting because like Peterson's always talking about how you are what you act out, and then there's this pastor that I follow on YouTube who always comments about how Peterson doesn't act very much like a Christian since he never goes to church. So it's like if Sam Harris is an atheist, but and then what does that make Jordan Peterson? Because like
I'm pretty convinced that the answer to that is atheist, even though he won't say it. But that's neither here nor there. But this goes back to what I was saying. Either the fact that they both have the same set of ethics and reach the same conclusion is not a argument against Harris.
What if
Peterson is saying, Harris, you've reached the same conclusions I have, therefore my premises are true? It's like, no, that's not how that works.
What if Harris is working off of falsely assumed presumptions?
Well, that's the same argument he's making against Peterson. Yeah. So to the extent one or both of them is going off the wrong presumption, this is something worthy of discussion.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Harris could be wrong. I don't think he would necessarily dispute with it.
Yeah.
Well,
it'd be pretty arrogant to say I've arrived at the correct premises and derived the conclusion properly. Where you have, it's like,
I don't know.
Hopefully, we're close.
Sam's pretty arrogant.
He's not arrogant, but yeah.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah. All right. So other than that, I can think of one other thing that I really want to get to from the discussion notes that we've had.
Mm-hmm.
So anything else people want to throw in?
No, let's move on.
Change up.
Yeah.
Alrighty. So the one that had the biggest impact on me from the discussions is these notes. So I'll just read the notes directly. So integration of the shadow requires courage and imagination. Fear of becoming your shadow means you constrain your imagination to remain ignorant of truth that may lie within and or outside the shadow, inhibiting your ability to adapt, integrate, and succeed yourself. One is not necessarily constrained by a lack of empathy, but by a lack of imagination of how compassion can be cruel and abused. So that last point about compassion is a separate but not entirely independent point. But this idea of the integration with your shadow, requiring courage as well as imagination, kind of ties into, you know, there's a theme which probably since humans were born was wondering how, you know, I subjectively can be smart, yet these people can subjectively be dumb through my own projections of what is good and what is bad. And, you know, everyone wonders, like, how can this person be so ignorant or deluded or naive? Why can't they see things the way I see things? And to a large extent now, it's also, what would you call it, represented in the way of, well, that person isn't thinking with enough sophistication on this issue. And SJWs use this line of thinking, as well as the people at the SJWs fight, like the alt-right or the anti-SJWs crowd. They all kind of view the others as a little bit naive and ignorant. And it seems to some extent the issue here is going to be, well, we thought about it, and at least, you know, the way I phrase it here is that, well, let's say there's something you fear that could be true or may not be true, but, you know, let's just say if you change a certain quality about yourself, so let's say it could be that compassion may not be the end, or compassion could actually lead to atrocities like the Gulag Archipelago. Or, for instance, race realism could lead to atrocities like Nazi Germany. Then what can happen is you can then say, well, this is a big fear that I have, so I'm not going to, and I don't feel I have the capacity or the courage to be able to enter into that without becoming the horrific thing I detest. So to some extent, then you're saying, I'm not going to go there at all because I don't wish to fall into the abyss. And for a large extent, I think most people, then that statement is going to be beneficial for them, because I think that most people, and I argue this from looking around and then working backwards, like a reverse engineered assumption, because most people do not seem to, you know, go into the depths of critical thinking of things that are incredibly difficult, because, and it seems to be, well, working backwards, then maybe they don't have the capacity to come out with the skin on top. It's easier for them to trust people who, you know, they inherently trust through other means to do that wrestling within themselves. And that's probably why we hold religious figures like Buddha or Jesus so highly, because, you know, they were able to introspect to an extent that others weren't willing to, or, you know, that many people do, but yet they fall off the deep end. So to run on from that, then, okay, well, it's reasonable then to say, okay, if you risk becoming the thing you fear from tackling the thing you fear and doing it alone, then perhaps it's not worth embarking on a hero's journey to conquer it, because you don't have the support infrastructure in place, or the support structures, I should say. Whereas if you were to then engage on that path towards dealing with that fear where you no longer fear it, then you do that step of courage, then perhaps then you can now, you unlock the ability of your imagination to then tackle the thing that you fear. Because if you are too afraid to even tackle it, then your imagination can't even go there. It may, the only ways it may go there is through haunting you through dreams and nightmares. Because it's saying, we need you to tackle this, but yet you may not be ready. And to some extent, this is what PTSD people do, as well as people who suppress, like repress emotions or repress memories. It's situations where they're not yet able to deal with something. So then so it actually constrains someone's thinking capacity or their imagination around that. So then if you express the courage, you tackle what you fear, then you can imagine ways of destroying it, or even realizing ways it could be true, in which case this is then the integration, which is then if you can integrate what you fear within yourself, so you integrate your shadow, then if you come out on top, then you've now mastered that monstrosity within you to now use it as a tool rather than it using you as its own program for maliciousness. And when we apply this then towards morality, then it seems the morality that is the most sustainable is the morality that can integrate the most, integrate the most and be able to reason with it or wrestle with it. Whereas the one morality that can only ignore another morality to rule it off as complete evil, is now to say they are threatened by this ulterior morality, in which case they will butt heads at some point with war.
Well, yeah. Thinking of that within its modern context, and the far right and the far left, the necessary morality to combat that is one that can encapsulate both views or point out the flaws within the views based off of the very axioms that they kind of rest upon. So it might be like, in order to prove the utility of equality, but not of having it as its highest place in the value hierarchy, is to point out what a world in which equality is, what a world would look like with equality as the most important thing between people. Like, it's done kind of in satire with like Harrison Bergeron by Kurt Vonnegut Jr. About the society where every single person is like weighed down with weights, or the intelligent people have like a buzzing that occurs within their heads, and of course that's like a farcical view on like what true equality would look like if attempted to be implemented. But it's done as to make the point that equality as your primary moral compass is invalid, or it's not invalid. It leads to bad outcomes. I think a similar thing is done with Brave New World, that kind of using that same conception of morality and like what is desirable to show how if we craft humanity in order to become like these cattle just for experiencing pleasure, this is what that type of society would look like. And yeah, any like normal person would want to reject that. Well, maybe not any normal person, because a lot of people born into current modern morality might see that as the inevitable outcome that's worth fighting for, which, I don't know, at least for me is frightening. I know you were all aboard for the Brave New World outcome, weren't you?
Oh yeah, totally. The whole time I'm reading it, I'm like, this sounds fantastic. And even like afterwards, like through our discussion group, like it was only, I think we discussed that one a few times, I think, and it was only through the discussion group that I actually, like the whole time I'm reading it, I'm thinking John is just this naive romantic, and none of what he's saying is actually should be regarded in any sense of, with any sensibility. But then afterwards, like the thing that really got me to change, and as well, it's just like, like, I don't know, it sounds fantastic, like the Brave New World from Miley. And it's just like, you get to have sex with whoever you want, and the society's architected where you never feel as if you're useless. Like you have your place in society and you fit in it and you do your job and you have meaning in that. But the only thing that really took me aback was this idea that we could be living in, like, let's say we're living in the Matrix, or, you know, like willingly, like we've signed up to live in a virtual reality where we could have everything we want and all our needs met kind of thing, to the extent where we're satiated, right? Then if I'm living this Rogue Player 1 situation, or this Total Recall situation, like I've willingly signed up, then the thing is, and I'm engaging in this virtual reality knowing, then what's going to pull me out of it is this idea of, well, what happens if someone's in the room with me right now who is hurting me, right? What happens if in reality someone is ciphering my bank account, right? Like this fear of what's actually happening in reality. And I think this is like the tinkering thing that has set mankind aback, which is, no, not aback, but forward, is this idea of we can now imagine what we call it, threats that are outside our present. And in doing so, we now want to defend ourselves against imagined threats. And if we can know that in this virtual world, like be it video games or be it a virtual reality, then we have to neutralize our ability to defend ourselves against future threats. Like this whole anxiety, like this angst that we naturally have. And to me, that then if you ignore that, it doesn't seem you can dissolve it. It only seems you can ignore it. And if you ignore it, it seems to then result in depression, because you're trying to subdue the thing or the part of you that is trying to keep you safe.
Yeah, I've kind of had that idea where if we were to upload our consciousnesses into some sort of computer, like I always imagine, like, okay, what happens if like lightning strikes and the power goes out, and then like 100 million consciousnesses just kind of snap out of existence in that moment. And it's like, I don't know, it seems, I guess, a pathetic end for humanity.
I'm not sure if it's more pathetic than the current one, but okay.
Well, we haven't ended yet.
No. So to tie into these points, there's another point from the discussion that tied into that other point that I read out. So that point is the one about adult children, law, and consent. So the point here, as noted, is adults that view other adults as children are dangerous. That society failed to integrate those individuals into adults, and therefore they must be discarded or reprimanded. Religion served a role in accepting society as a mode of civility with competing narratives. No religion anymore allows ideological leans to arrogantly view themselves as superior without integration, and also with opposition as children who are naive, ignorant, or petulant. So we see this, for instance, with liberals viewing conservatives who voted for Trump as naive, ignorant, or petulant children. And you also see it from the other side, where conservatives can view liberals as a mental disorder. And for both extent, then it's saying you did not properly integrate into society. You did not develop from child to adult where you can be respected as an independent operative. Instead, you still have more learning to do. And this was taken from a different discussion that is too off topic for this, the Sam Harris versus Peterson debate. But it's the idea that within the family unit or within a civil society, the job is to raise the children from a dependent unit into an independent unit that can be respected and to also respect. So they are now a civil unit that can operate within society as a, you know, a cog in the machine, but also one that repairs the machine. But if you then view yourself as the only adult, or your group as the adults that have matured and yet other adults haven't, then it allows you the moral ability to then treat them as children, that is with less rights. and to actually violate their consent. So the reason we treat children with less rights is because we consider them to not have integrated as an independent unit yet. And that is our role, to help them do so. And so that becomes incredibly dangerous. And the role about religion here is, before, like say with the United States, you know, there was still the separation of state and church, but maybe less so to how Australia has implemented it. But there's still this idea of there can be multiple practicing religions, and then society should be secular. But there was still religions. So religions provided you this. So it kind of said, well, operating in state with your neighbors, though even those outside your community, but still within your government, like still within your country, then there is still the expectation of civility that is imposed by law. And then the role of how to nurture a child into an adult is provided by religion. And, you know, there was a dominant religion in the USA, which was Christianity. And, you know, that then allowed everyone to then, I guess, say, okay, well, we can assume that adults have, you know, become adults by, you know, at that age of 21, then we can now treat them as this independent unit that is responsible for their own actions. Whereas I think if we eliminate religion, that has kind of happened, then what it allows is then to say, well, there isn't this unifying narrative of this development of, you know, what clearly marks child and what clearly marks adult. And it's kind of now up to anyone's own ideological morality to then say, well, you don't share mine, and I have no need to respect yours. And then I think that then leads the SJW to go into law to then enforce their own morality onto adults as if they're children. And you see this with HR departments in companies, where we don't believe you're qualified to be adults, so here's a code of conduct that you must all abide by, which is insulting. Yeah, which is quite insulting, but you can understand why, because to some extent, especially with Europe, if you let in all these refugees, which clearly did not share your country's development of adult, no, from child to adult, then clearly now you have to treat them as children, in terms of you now need to educate them on how to behave. But if you now destroy the homogeneity of your society, then it's very easy for everyone now to view other groups or other individuals as children who now need to be taught how to be.
Yeah, I can't see how you can escape groupishness or tribalism, aside from, well, in certain situations, you can expand the tribe outwards, to your entire nation, when like each of you share some sort of common identity, such as like American, and maybe some even shared common threat with like the Russians and during the Cold War. There is that aspect of shared ethics or shared American values in that situation. So I don't know if you can like expand that all the way out to all human beings, because in order to do that, you would all have to be sharing the same values. But the problem is, like, on such a wide environment, or wide divergent environment to be living within, our values are going to be evolved differently for our different tribes. So like in situations where there's a lot more people and not a lot of capacity for individualism, then your mentality and your ethics are going to be built upon what is best for the most amount of people. as opposed to what's best for you as a moral agent. That's just one divergence of morality that would make it hard to create some sort of universal ethic for everyone.
Yeah. Well, that I think is going to conclude for me tonight, but I enjoyed our conversation.
Oh, wow, we just got a whole bunch of comments. Oh, no, it just updated for me. That's why. Oh.
Yeah, we do have someone commenting right now called Daniel. But we'll say bye to Kurt. I just want to wrap up this this topic for another 5 minutes.
Okay.
For 5 minutes.
Sure.
Okay. Yeah, so for this point, I think the adult and children situation, it is hard because, like, but I think we didn't, I think, have this much of an issue as we have now with the modern polarization because of the role of religion. But to some extent, it's weird because, well, always, like, say, when it comes to rights, we already treat certain adults as if the child, even legally, so those with reduced capacity to reason, the mentally disabled, or those on life support, they have reduced rights. And you know, that can be arguable, but but then to some extent, I think one of the parts of here has been, or the breadcrumbs or the legacy of postmodernism for the worse has been this disrespect for law, that law is a social construct and it isn't the best learnings we've had about how to operate society. It is this patriarchal, silly thing that needs to be done away with to mediate the interests of a particular group. And, you know, you have the people like Frederick Breistart, which wrote with the law, like pretty much the Libertarian Manifesto, to say that as soon as a government becomes philanthropic, then every group now wants their interests at the expense of another. And to some extent, well, if we disrespect the law, then we disrespect the fabrics of what actually provided the civility to respect other adults. So, for instance, like age of consent, culturally, that is very different all through the world. But if we then show this type of, you know, relative cultural perspective over what our country's law mandates, then it becomes a slippery slope to then say, well, you know, morality is relative to beholder, which paves way to a lot of bad. And, you know, we can then decide to continuously amend the law with what we currently perceive to be beneficial for our in-group, rather than having a law that, like, so in the law by Frederick Breistart, then he talks about how the law should benefit everyone and never at the expense of someone. And anything outside of that should then be in the role of the private. And so, for instance, the government should have no rights that an individual does not have, and no collective should have a right that an individual doesn't have. But to some extent, I don't know enough about that topic yet to think that's a good idea, because to some extent, like, a private company does have rights that an individual doesn't have, which is that it is then, if it liquidates, it doesn't affect the individuals. Whereas if you're an individual, it can seize your assets and then your wife's assets if you didn't pay your debts. So there is parts there, but I think this is a discussion we haven't had yet, and we can move that to next week's study group sessions. So to finish up this one, this is a discussion for the Jordan B Peterson community. You can find the details at jordanbpeterson.community. So instead of .com.community, each week we discuss lectures or Peterson content. On the second week of every month, no, the last week of every second month, we discuss one of Peterson's recommended texts. So the end of September, it will be Maps of Meaning. And you can find, all the details at jordanbpeterson.community. Just to read off Daniel's comments, just to pay him the respect. So he's written, a thread through all living beings, anything living or even inanimate matter, the quantum fabric. Sounds familiar. Law for every person, law unto themselves. Indeed, so that can be a useful mechanism. Yay, lobsters. So Daniel, if you want to join in, check out the jordanbpeterson.community. You can do /study-group. All the details should already be in the description of this video, and maybe we'll get you participating in the conversation next time. All right, over to you, John, to hit that stop broadcast button.
Yep. Okay, just wanted to make sure. So the discussion on maps of meaning, that's going to start the 28th?
Yeah, the last week of this this month.
Or yeah, for you it's the 29th. Okay, cool. All right, yeah. Thanks for joining, anybody who's listening. Yeah, good night, Kurt. Thanks for the conversation, both of you. See ya.
Later.